Okay, so today I want to share with you the secret to subordinate respect. At some point in your lives, if you are successful, you will find yourselves supervising other human beings. And I hate to tell you, that's not a positive thing. Once you get into it and you figure out what that's all about, you'll know that you'd rather not be responsible for people than to be responsible for them. But you're going to end up in this situation, so here's what you need to understand. Do you think your subordinates will respect you because of your fine Missouri State University education? No. Do you think they'll even respect you because of your job title? No. So I was 25 years old when I got my first responsibility for subordinates. And the guy that hired me into that role was someone I'd worked for previously. And he reminded me of a cross between Bill Clinton and a Labrador Retriever. You know, the best qualities of both. So he's a very, very kind, gentle man. I had no idea that he had things like this in his head. He calls me in one day, this is about 2 weeks into my stint as a supervisor. And he says, "So how's it going?" I said, "It's going fine." And he says, asked me a couple more questions. And he says, "Well, you know what you need to do?" And I said, "No." He says, "You need to fire someone." I said, "What?" He said, "You need to fire someone." I said, "Who?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "What are you telling me?" He says, "Hey, every group you've ever worked in, hasn't there been at least one person that needed to be fired?" Does that ring true to you guys? Every group you've ever worked in. And if you've never had a job, if you've been on a team with people, there's always a slacker who deserves it. He said, "You need to find that person and fire them." And I said, "Why?" He said, "You're 25 years old." He said, "Your workers are on average 45 years old. These people will never respect you, but at least they can fear you." Do you understand how this works? Pretty sad, isn't it? But this is how humans, by the way, we're just animals, right? The Chinese have an expression, "Kill a chicken to scare the monkeys." They'll take one person and make an example of them. Not because they're necessarily wanting to punish that one person, but because of what the message they're trying to send to everybody else. Now here's the end of my story. I went out and found my volunteer. He volunteered for this firing pretty quickly. And I fired him. Before I fired him, I had 26 people making 26 valves per month. So it was one valve per person per month, basically. After I fired him, I only had 25 people, but my production jumped to 31 valves per month. There's a couple of reasons for that. Do you think slackers might have pulled their socks up a bit after seeing what I did to, his name was Jimmy, after seeing what I did to Jimmy? Yeah. But the other thing is this, you've got decent people in your group who feel stupid for doing a good job because they see Jimmy doing a bad job and they realize there's no reward for doing a good job. And so they feel stupid. And so after you fire Jimmy, suddenly they don't have to feel stupid anymore and their productivity improves. Any questions? Okay, let's get this off. Something I've told you guys before, and it's going to come in it's going to be really impactful today, and that is people are scumbags. And we're going to run into this over and over and over again today, so I want you to keep this in mind. So last time, we were talking about the cost of financial distress, and we went through the slide, and we got through, and we were talking about milking the property. We're going to move on now, and we're going to do some examples here. And we're going to start with this company that's in financial distress. And this is a weird balance sheet. It's weird because it shows both the book value and the market value of the firm. And so the cash, book value and market value are the same. Does that make sense to you? Unless you're lying about the amount of cash you've got on the books, these should be exactly the same because a dollar is worth how much? $1, right? Now, the fixed assets have a book value of 400, but a market value of 0. You say, wait a minute, how can something have a book value of this positive number and a market value of 0? Remember that book value is just the historical cost, or what you paid for it, minus the accumulated depreciation. It doesn't have anything to do with what the asset's really worth. So there's a couple of ways you could wind up in a situation like this. Number one, you could be, let's say that you've got a seafood restaurant down on the coast in Florida, really popular place, but you've got no insurance and a hurricane comes through and wipes it out. What's the market value of your assets? 0. Book value would still be there, the market value is gone. Another would be obsolescence. So for example, on semiconductors, they talk about the processes used to make semiconductors in terms of nanometers. So the smaller the little lines are between the little transistors, that's the nanometers. The smaller that number is, the more dense you can make your chip, the more energy efficient it is, the less heat you're creating. There's all sorts of good things that go along with that. And so if I've got a machine that is made for 15 nanometer chips, and suddenly now the standard is 12 nanometers, but that equipment is obsolete. I can't sell that equipment for the book value. So it's totally possible to have a market value of your fixed assets that's lower than the book value. Now we know that the total assets, we're just going to add these things up. So the book value of our total assets are 600. And so let's look at the other side of the balance sheet. What do we know has to be true about assets plus owner's equity based on the number of the amount of assets we have book value? What do they have to add up to? Mr. Bardwash, what do they have to add up to? Oh man. So the cash plus the fixed assets, that's your total assets, has to be equal to your liabilities plus owner's equity. That's the balance sheet equation. Folks, this is your third finance class and you've got, what, 6 hours of accounting under your belt? Really time that you guys have this down, right? Okay, so we know that the liabilities plus owner's equity has to add up to 600, and here we see that it does. We've got 300 in long-term bonds and we've got 300 in equity. But we can transfer that same idea over to the market value side. We know that the market value of the liability plus the owner's equity has to be equal to 200 because the value of the firm's assets only 200. Do you see that? Now the question is this: where does that 200 go? It's not enough to pay either the bondholders or the shareholders. Who does it go to?
The bondholders.
Yeah, it's got to go to the bondholders. Now, is it enough to make them whole? No, but it's all going to go to the bondholders. Remember, shareholders have a residual claim. You get, as a shareholder, you get what's left over after the debt holders are taken care of. How much is left over here? Nothing, right? Okay. Any questions so far? This is just the setup, and we're going to use the setup to walk through some different scenarios. So our first selfish strategy is the extreme risk taking. We talked about the Hail Mary pass last time. This is what we're talking about. So the Hail Mary pass is this extreme risk taking. So this firm, by the way, what's this firm going to be worth to the shareholders if we don't do anything? Zero, right? And so the shareholders, they say, wait a minute, is there something we could do that might make this thing turn out okay for us? And the answer is they've got this risky project. It's risky because there's only a 10% chance of success. If it does succeed, they're going to get $1,000. If they lose, of course, they get nothing. And there's a 90% chance that they're going to get nothing. Now, the cost of the investment is $200. That is all the firm's cash. The required return is 50%. You say, wait a minute, 50% sounds kind of high. What do we know about the relationship between risk and return?
The return has to correlate with the risk.
Yeah, so the
if
higher the
is
risk,
return needs to be higher.
the higher the risk, the higher the return. Now we've got a thing here that's only got a 10% chance of taking off. 50% is actually probably low. In fact, if you look at venture capital firms are when you first, you've got a business that's starting and you've already ran through all the money that you can borrow and beg and steal from your relatives. Then you move on to venture capital. And venture capitalists, they know these little businesses that they're getting involved with are risky. So instead of demanding returns in terms of percent, they demand multiples. Well, we're going to need 7 times return on that. We're going to need 12 times return on that. And the reason they demand that is because these things are so hugely risky. Now, how does venture capital work then? Do you think they just take on one project? No, they take on like 40 projects expecting one of them to succeed. One of them is going to be the next Facebook. One of them is going to be the next Google. The rest of them can all go in the toilet, but they don't know which one. So they have to take on all these projects, but the expected return is extraordinarily high for each individual project. Okay, so the expected cash flow from that gamble is 10% of 1,000. Why 10%? Because the expected cash flow is the probability of the outcome times the outcome if it happens. 10% probability of 1,000 payoff gives us 100. A 90% probability of 0 payoff gives us what? What's 90% of 0? 0. So really all we have to worry about here is that 10% of 1,000 gives us $100. So we can calculate the NPV of this thing, and it is minus 200 because we have to invest 200 up front. That's a cash outflow. And then our expected cash inflow is 100 1 year into the future. Why are we dividing by 1.5?
1 plus
Discount.
return.
Yeah, so it's 1 plus the required return to the first power because we're only 1 period into the future. And so basically that second piece there is the present value of 100 if we get it 1 year from today. And so when we see this, we calculate out the NPV, we come out with negative 133, or roughly. Now, what is the rule for NPV? We accept all
Or positive.
positive projects. Should we be accepting this project? No. We should not be accepting this project except for one thing. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. And I'm going to show you on the next slide that what we're actually doing here with taking this gamble is maximizing shareholder wealth. So we've got our expected cash flows from the gamble. To the bondholders, they've got a 10% chance of getting 300. Why only 300?
That's all they're owed.
That's all they're owed. Remember, debt is a fixed claim. So the best that they're going to hope for is to get that 300. They've got a 10% chance of that. But what happens in the event of failure?
They get nothing.
They get nothing. Remember, they would have gotten 200 if we had decided not to take on this project. But if we do the project and it fails, they get nothing. And so we've actually got 300 times 0.10 plus 0 times 0.90 gives us $30. So to the stockholders, though, if this thing pays off, it gives us 1,000 minus the 300 we have to pay the bondholders, so that's 700, multiplied by the 10% chance that the gamble pays off gives us 70, plus 0 times 0.90 gives us the expected cash flow of $70. So the present value of the bonds without the gamble is 200, the amount of the cash that we have right now. If and the present value of the stocks without the gamble is 0. If we take the gamble, though, The present value of the bonds is going to be equal to that 30 that they'll receive in 1 year divided by 1.5, which is 1 plus r to the first power. And that tells us the present value of the bonds with the gamble is $20. The present value of the stock, however, remember it was 0 without the gamble. Now it's 47. How did we get 47? Well, it's roughly 47. It's not perfectly. If we take 70 divided by 1.5, it gives us $47. So we have taken stock that was worth nothing and we've made it worth $47 just by taking on this gamble. However, what has that done to the bondholders? It's taken their position, which was worth 200, and now what is it worth? 20. Who do the managers work for? The shareholders or the bondholders?
Shareholders.
Shareholders. What's the goal of financial management?
Maximize shareholder.
Maximize shareholder wealth. Should the managers take on this gamble? Yeah. Pretty sad, isn't it? Okay, so we see that that is the first strategy of the Hail Mary pass, the big risky project. Now, the second thing that can happen is called underinvestment. Underinvestment is when we have a positive NPV project, but we don't take it on because it would be bad for the shareholders. So we'll walk through how that can be. So the same company has this government-sponsored project. In other words, the cash flow is almost certain, so therefore the required return is only 10%. The cost of the investment is $300. Now keep in mind, the firm only has $200 right now. That means in order to take on this investment, the shareholders are going to have to chip in another $100. So what is the NPV of this project? Well, one thing we haven't told you yet is that it's going to pay off $350 in 1 year. So if we were to find the NPV of that thing, it's 350 divided by 1.10 to the first power, because R is 0.10. That gives us, and we subtract the 300 initial investment, leaves us with $18.18. What is the rule, the NPV rule? Except what? All positive projects. All positive NPV projects. Is this a positive NPV project? Yeah. By the rule, should we accept it? We should, but we're not going to, and here's why. We look at it from both the bondholder and the shareholder perspective. If we take on this project, the bondholders will get their full $300. Remember that the bondholders, if we don't take on this project, are only going to get how much? 200. And so the bondholders would be absolutely thrilled for us to take on this project. The stockholders, however, will be getting the 350 minus the 300 they have to pay to the debt holders, and only puts them ahead by 50. So what are the present value of the bonds with the project? It's just the present value of that 300. 300 divided by 1.10 gives us $273 roughly. But if we look at the present value of the stocks, it's actually, we've got that 50 payoff divided by 1.10 minus that 100 that the stockholders had to throw into that thing to make it work. As a result, to the stockholders, the NPV of this thing is minus $54.55. In other words, they'll be worse off for having taken on the project. The bondholders are the ones who reap the gains. The shareholders reap a loss from doing this. would we, from the shareholders' perspective and the managers work for the shareholders, should we take on this project? Absolutely not. And so that's our second problem that we see is underinvestment. We are walking away from positive NPV projects because they only are benefiting the bondholders. They're not benefiting the shareholders. In fact, in this case, they are hurting the shareholders. And then finally, we have milking the property. We talked a little bit about milking the property last time. We've got this firm and we've got 200 in cash. Who's that 200 in cash going to unless we do something different?
Bondholders.
Yeah, it's going to go to the bondholders. And so if I wanted to, unless there's a bond covenant saying that we cannot do this, I could go ahead as the CEO and the board of directors, we could pay out a liquidating dividend of 200 to the shareholders and then declare bankruptcy of the firm. If I did that, the shareholders would get 200. How much would the bondholders get? 0. Now, hopefully there are indentures in place to prevent this kind of behavior, and we'll talk about some things that we're going to try to put in place with bonds to prevent this kind of behavior. But sometimes you'll see bonds that don't have those indentures, and so could actually happen. More commonly, what we see is that the managers will increase their perquisite consumption. Now, what is perquisite consumption? Can anyone tell me what a perquisite is?
Perks.
Perks, very good. That's what we talk about. Oh, that's one of the perks of the job. For instance, in the summertime, I don't have to work. That's a perk to my job. I also get to work in this lovely air-conditioned building, and when I watch the roofers doing the roof across the street, I think, I am so grateful for that. Now, is it money that they're giving me? No, it's a cool, pleasant working environment. So those are the perks of my job. Let's talk about what are some of the perks that a CEO might enjoy. Undoubtedly, you guys have dreamed of becoming CEO, and you say, well, when I'm CEO, I'm going to...
I'd probably give out bonuses, give out, company vehicles, bigger offices.
Very good. Now, are you going to fly economy class on Spirit Airlines? Are you going to fly Spirit Airlines at all?
Your private jet.
Private jet, baby, right? So we've got this money, and we know that if we don't spend it, it's just going to go to those rascal bondholders anyway. So we might as well live it up while we can. And so I was going to get a Chevrolet as my company car, but now I'm going to get a BMW. Undoubtedly, that BMW will be swept up in the bankruptcy and eventually be liquidated. But do you know how long that's going to take? It's going to take quite a while. In the meantime, I'm going to be rolling, and the bondholders are going to be hating. You guys know that song? They see me rolling, they be hating. Okay. I know it's old. Okay. So this is another thing that the shareholders could, or the management could do is, let's have our annual shareholder meeting. And this year, instead of peanuts and punch served as refreshments, we're going to have New York strip and only the finest wine for our shareholders, right? We're going to have a big party, and we're going to spend up all that $200 or $200,000 or $200 million, whatever it is, and what will be left for the bondholders? Nothing. Does that sound scumbaggy? Yeah, it actually is quite scumbaggy. Now, can the costs of debt be reduced? So we've been talking about all of these things that will make people less likely to want to loan us money. If they thought we were going to take the Hail Mary pass, would they want to loan us more money or less? Less. If they thought we were going to do the underinvestment thing, would they want to loan us more money or less? Less. If they thought we were going to pay the liquidating dividend, would they loan us money at all? No. And so these are all risks. If I've got riskier, therefore debt, what do you think is going to happen to the required return these people are going to demand from us? Yeah, it's got to be higher. It's going to increase our cost of borrowing. So how can we go about limiting those increases in debt costs because of that increased risk? Well, we can start with these things called protective covenants. These covenants are all in something called the bond indenture. Did you guys study the bond indenture in Fin 380 or Fin 390? It's just the agreement between the bond holders and the bond issuer. And so in the covenant, by the way, the indenture is written by who? The borrower or the lender? It's written by the borrower. So you guys are used to, when you go to borrow money to buy a car or do anything, that they dictate the terms and you choose either to take them and get the money or don't take them and not get the money. But it's really easy because there's only one borrower and one lender. The problem with bonds is that we have a boatload of lenders and only one borrower. I guarantee if I had you 7 people create a bond indenture, what you would like to see, do you think they're going to match? No, I can guarantee they won't. And then you guys would probably argue amongst each other about what should be in there and what should not be in there. Now, think about the position of a company. They're putting this bond issue out to customers, to bond buyers that are not even actually known to them at this point. So what they have to do is put together a bond indenture that will be attractive enough to raise the funds they need at the price they can afford. So what kinds of things would they put into the bond indenture to help bring down that required yield to maturity? We have a bunch of different options here, and I want to point out to you that this is like the buffet. When you go to the buffet, do you necessarily take something of everything? Okay, maybe you do. But most of the time you're walking by and you're like, whoa, those green beans look a little sad. I think I'm going to skip those, right? So you only pick what you want. And it's the same thing when you're building a bond indenture. You can choose from a bunch of different covenants. A really popular one, the first one that we've got listed there, is the limit on dividends. Remember, we talked about scumbaggy strategy number 3 would be to pay out a liquidating dividend to the shareholders. And basically that would leave the bondholders with nothing. So typically what we see are bond indentures that limit the amount of money paid out to a percentage less than 100% of earnings per share. In other words, I'm going to say you can't pay out any more than 40% of your EPS as dividends. Now, why do you think we would do that? What's the idea?
To prevent the selfish strategy 3 of milking the property.
Yeah, it's to prevent milking the property. And so what we want to do is make sure that they are not going to pull that trick. We also want to make sure that they have enough cash on hand to pay our coupons. Does that make sense? Now, here's a dirty little fact about corporate borrowing. Do you think that corporations truly ever pay their debt off? No. What they do is they'll make the coupon payments all the way down until the bond is about to mature. Then what do? Issue new bonds and use the new money to pay off the old money. Does that make sense? And so as long as I can make sure that these people can actually pay their coupons, and I'm going to be good. I'm going to be good at least until the maturity date of the bond, and probably beyond that because they'll just go out and issue more bonds, assuming they can. So that's why we'd want to limit the dividends. Now, another one is that the firm may not pledge assets to other lenders. Let me give you an example of pledging assets to more than one lender. So I've got this house, and according to Zillow, it's worth $400,000. I think that's total crap. But according to Zillow, the house is worth $400,000. I need to borrow $250,000. By the way, my house is totally paid off, $400,000 market value. I go first to Captain Barentine and I say, here's my $400,000 house. Please feel free to have it appraised. Would you be willing to loan me $250,000 versus that house? With the house as collateral? Sure, of course you would. Now, I go to Mr. Roy. I say, hey, now you haven't heard what I just did here, right? Okay. And I give you the same spiel. Will you loan me $250,000? Yeah, of course you will. So then I get to Mr. Rowlands, and I ask you, it's not going to come over here, that's cool. I say, would you loan me the money? And you say, of course you would. Now, here's what I do. I take each of your $250,000. Psycho. I take each of your $250,000, so that's $750,000 total, and do you know what I do? I go to Mexico, right? I just take your crap and go to Mexico. By the way, you can buy citizenship in Mexico for around $100,000. It's not constitutionally correct, but you know, and I know someone that did. So, yeah, $100,000 you can buy citizenship. So there I am, plus $650,000 down in Guadalajara. $650,000 will buy a lot of tequila, right? Having a good time. Okay. Now, here's the problem. By the way, how many mortgage payments do you think I would make on those loans before I headed to Mexico? None. And so you guys, 90 days from then, you figure out what I've done. You figure out that I slipped town. And so Mr. Barentine says, well, I'm just going to go over there and foreclose on his ass since he's not paying his mortgage. So he comes over to ring the doorbell, and just then Mr. Roy starts coming up the sidewalk. And Mr. Roy says, hey, what are you doing here? And Mr. Barentine says, I'm here to claim my house. Mr. Roy, what do you say to that?
On my house.
Wait a minute, it's my house. And just about that time, Mr. Rowland ambles up the sidewalk, and he's like, hey! It's a party. What are you guys doing here? And you guys say you're here to get the house, and you say,
It's my house.
it's my house. You know what this leads to? A three-way fist fight. By the way, this is what that looks like, right? It's a three-way fist fight. Now, do you think that in the corporate world it's really going to work that way? No. But here's the problem. All three of the lawyers show up at the same time with the same claim on the same assets, and they're going to have to fight it out in court. What is the best outcome they can hope for?
We split it 3 ways.
Yeah, right? And so each of you would be getting less or a little over $80,000 if we had to go to court over this. And so one of the things I'm going to promise not to do is pledge assets to other lenders. So when the time comes and you guys come to get your assets, that they're there for you and they're not being claimed by other people. The next one, and remember, I told you this is a cafeteria, it's a buffet. And the next one is not one that you'll see in a lot of larger firms. First, its firms may not merge. Let's talk about Walmart. You may not think of Walmart doing a lot of mergers, but they actually do. So the other day I was visiting an experimental site here on South Campbell in Springfield where they actually have robots that are putting things into inventory and pulling things out of inventory for when you drive up and they put the stuff in your car. Okay, so they were working with the robot people, the provider of the robots, and they said, we want the code that you use to run the robots. And the people at the company said, well, that's fine, but it's our code, it's proprietary, so we're not going to give it to you. Walmart's response was to buy the company. You buy the company, can you get the code? Yeah, and by the way, buying a little robotics company for Walmart, rounding error, right, versus their net income. And so not a big deal. But Walmart does that all the time. They go around and acquire firms that they think are going to be useful to them. Amazon does it, Apple does it, lots of people do it. So you will never see in their bond indentures that they will not merge. Let's talk about, though, why you might find that indenture to be attractive if you were looking at buying the bonds of a firm. Let's say that I have a firm, and my firm owns dairies. Those are the places where you get milk out of cows. And my dairies have a guaranteed profit contract with the local school district. I know I can sell every drop of milk I produce with a guaranteed profit of 10%. Does that sound fairly safe? Yeah, because people keep making kids keep drinking milk, there we go. Okay, so when I go out to get sell my bonds, you guys might only require 4% because they're so extraordinarily safe. And so I sell you these bonds. Now my brother-in-law, on the other hand, has a nuclear waste cleanup company. By the way, do you think nuclear waste cleanup is safe or risky? It's risky for two reasons. First of all, it's radiologically risky, which is not going to come into play here. But more importantly is, how do we know where the next radioactive cleanup job is going to come? Do we know in advance? No. Unless you can predict tsunamis that are going to wash away Fukushima and lead to this big cleanup job, you can't predict what those cash flows are going to be, so they're very uncertain. And so they're going to be extraordinarily risky. So if my brother-in-law sells bonds, people are going to require, let's say, 8% on his bonds. Only 4% on mine, 8% on his. So far, everyone is getting compensated according to the risk of the business. But here's the problem. My brother-in-law and I meet up over Thanksgiving, and we're discussing our businesses. And we decide that we should merge our businesses. And by the way, they're both identically the same size, and we merge them together, and we both have identically the same amount of debt. And now what happens is that the firm is riskier than the dairy firm was, but it's safer than the radioactive waste cleanup firm. Does that make sense? Because it's just the average of the two. Now, for the people who own the 4% bonds, they're not feeling really good because the required return on those bonds has now gone up to 6% to represent this new average higher level of risk. What happens to a bond price when the yield to maturity goes up? Mr. Buat. Yeah, it goes down. So this is the relationship between yield to maturity and bond price. It's purely mechanical. If yield to maturity goes up, bond value goes down. And so what happens to the value of those 4% bonds? They got to go down, right? Because now they're required to return 6%. However, what about the people who have loaned money to the radioactive cleanup? They are getting 8% coupons, but now the required return is only 6%. So what happens to the value of their bonds?
Increases.
Yeah, it increases, right? And so what happens when we have a risky firm merging with a safe firm? We see a transfer of wealth from the bondholders of the safe firm to the bondholders of the risky firm. That is purely all that's happening. It's a transfer of wealth from the bondholders of the risky firm, from the bondholders of the safe firm to the bondholders of the risky firm. From the bondholders of the safe firm to the bondholders of the risky firm. Now, if I'm a safe firm, I definitely want to put this in there if I don't have any idea that I'm going to be merging, because I want to pledge that I'm not going to pull this trick. What if I'm a risky firm? Is it as important for me? No, because after all, if I did merge, it's probably going to be with a safer firm, probably will lower the overall cost of borrowing, probably will increase the value of the outstanding bonds that I currently have. Any questions on that? Okay, now here's another one that you don't see very often, and that is that the firm may not issue any more long-term debt. Any idea why we don't see that one more often? Mr. Buat?
Could you issue longer-term debt to pay off your short-term debt?
Yeah, that's one thing we could do, is we could go ahead and issue new long-term debt to pay off old debt. Especially if we had a call option or a call provision in the bonds, we could do that. Or we could use the money to buy back bonds currently in the market. So that's basically a refinancing argument. Also, as a company grows, do you think they might need more debt? Yeah. So look back to Walmart, 1967. Come on. Ugh. Okay, Walmart 1967. Maybe they only had $1 million in debt. What do you think they have today? Probably billions, right? And so when you think about this, jerk. When you think about this, what it means is as a company grows, they're going to be taking on more debt. So if you were a company that was going to grow, would you put that line in there about not being able to issue additional long-term debt? Absolutely not. Now, would bondholders like to see that, though? Why would bondholders like to see that?
Because it limits the firm's probability of distress.
Yeah.
By restricting their debt.
If you can't issue additional long-term debt, that means that I have a higher probability of getting paid, right? Now, as we go through these, all of these are reducing risk for the bond holders. And as a result, that should reduce the required yield to maturity. And that's the goal, is to reduce our cost of borrowing, that required yield to maturity. Must maintain a minimum NWC. What does NWC stand for? Net working capital. What's the formula for net working capital? Oh,
Current assets minus current liabilities.
very good. Current assets minus current liabilities. So we have got, in current liabilities, we've got the current portion of long-term debt. And so that's going to be the coupons that we have to pay this period. What else are we having to pay current liability-wise?
Accounts payable.
Accounts payable. Accounts payable, money we owe to our suppliers. By the way, did you know that suppliers can push you into bankruptcy the same way that bondholders can push you into bankruptcy? If you don't pay your suppliers, they can force you into bankruptcy. And so as a bondholder, I want to make sure not only do they have enough money to pay the coupons, I want to make sure they have enough money to be able to pay their suppliers too. And so I want to demand that they keep a certain level of net working capital to make sure that they are able to take care of those bills to their suppliers. Is that logical? Okay. I'm trying to say, does that make sense less? Because apparently I say it like 12 times a minute. Now, the last one in this list is to provide financial statements to the lenders, or the bondholders. Why do you think the bondholders would be interested in seeing financial statements?
So that they can verify that the company is essentially being responsible or not going to default.
Yeah, so they can judge the financial condition of the firm would be the big one. But also, if I've promised to maintain a minimum net working capital, if I don't supply you with the financial statements, how do you know that I'm doing it? And so if I pledge to give you the financial statements, that should reduce the risk and therefore reduce the required yield of maturity. However, what kind of financial statements as a bondholder would I actually like to see? Just the ones prepared by the firm's accountant? What do we usually demand that firms do with their financial statements? Do we just take their word?
Audit.
Yeah, we want audited financial statements. And so if we get audited financial statements, that makes us, so having financial statements makes us feel better than having no financial statements. Having audited financial statements makes us feel better than having non-audited financial statements. But are audited financial statements a guarantee? No. Here's the problem. Who pays the auditor?
The company.
The company. And someday when we have more time, I will tell you a story about my interaction with an auditor, about something that should have been material. By the way, what's material?
Relevant.
Yeah, relevant, something that the shareholders would want to know about. This should have very definitely been material, and the auditor, basically after 3 or 4 discussions going up the chain, it somehow went away and never showed up in the audit report. And my guess is when it got to the upper levels, the company said, well, you know, we've been thinking about hiring a new auditor. Do you have any recommendations? At which point, what do you think the auditor did? Oh, never mind, right? And so there's a problem with the way audits are financed. They create this conflict of interest. I have a contact, he's retired now. He was a business broker. Business brokers help people to sell their businesses. And he would have these people come in and they say, I want to sell my business. Let's say it's a trucking business. I want to sell my business. And he'd say, well, we'll need to look at the financials. And they go, whoop, here's my financial statements. Now, small trucking company, do you think the financial statements are audited? No. Do you think the business broker would look at those financial statements and take them as truth? No. Now, he could say, you need to get your stuff audited. But instead, what he would always say is, I don't even want to see your financial statements. What I want to see are your tax returns. Why do you think he would rather see tax returns than financial statements?
They're probably not going to lie to the IRS.
Yeah, they're far less likely to lie to the IRS than they would be to lie to the business broker or a potential buyer of the firm. Why?
Because the IRS will come, well, they can audit that on their own. And then
They can audit that, and then you might get in trouble. Yeah, jail. By the way, did I tell you I know someone who did 7 years in federal prison? If you guys ever decide to embark on a life of crime, let me know, and I'll set you up with my bro Mark. And he can tell you that even the most minimum security federal prison is still no freaking holiday. So we don't want to lie to the government because we don't want to go to jail because it's not a holiday. So most likely our tax returns are going to be semi-legit.
Is Mark in for tax fraud?
No. Well, yes. And here's why. Almost everybody who gets money illegally also gets hit with tax charges. Because, did you know, you are required to report illegal income on your taxes? Mr. Bardwatch, this is probably the first time you've heard that, because in India, I don't know. But so they're like, oh yeah, you've got to report that illegal income. So here you are, you're a criminal. And you're like, oh shit, I need to pay taxes on that $1 million that I got illegally. Do you report it on your tax forms?
No.
Why not?
Admitting to a crime.
Yeah, you're confessing on paper to the government that you've committed a crime. And so here's what my bro did. He ran a mini Ponzi scheme. And he ended up, I forget, it was interesting. He had over $100 million in assets that were, and it was more than that he had under his control. and he only ended up stealing like 2 or 3 million. Oh yeah, I guess it's rounding error, right? But anyway, so to the people who he ripped off, it was a big deal, right? So not only did they ding him for stealing the 3 million, they dinged him for failing to pay taxes on the 3 million he stole.
Is that a significant uptick in sentence?
Okay, so I'm not sure. I do know he would have been better off without it. But here's the other lesson from his story. He had had 2 DUIs when he was in college. And when it came time to do the sentencing, the federal system, they have a points system, and they add up points. And so if you've had prior convictions, each one of those gets you additional points. And so he went into this thing thinking he was going to get 4 years, and he ended up getting 7 because he had these extra crimes he committed.
How did he get listed on the Ponzi scheme?
Well, actually, that's a good question. So what happened was he was a stockbroker, and what he would do is he had these, they were mostly elderly people from our hometown, and they trusted him because they knew him and his parents. His mother was a secretary at a grade school. I mean, everybody knew them, right? So they trusted him, and they had these really safe stocks. And so what he would do is take their safe stocks, he would sell them, put them into higher returning investments, and then sell the higher returning investments and replace their stock and whatever dividends had been paid in the meantime. So if this had kept going and the stock market had just kept going up, he would have been just fine. Except for one thing. One of his clients decided that she was going to take part of the stocks that he was holding for her and transfer them to her nephew, who was just getting started with Edward Jones. Edward Jones got the account number from her and electronically reached out to grab that stock. And when they did, the stock wasn't there. And so what happened is that by law and their procedures, they immediately contacted the Missouri Secretary of State to report this. And the Secretary of State turned around and reported it to the FBI. And the next thing he knows, he's got FBI. Now, I will tell you this, and I actually know 2 people who have been to federal prison, and both of them said most of the evidence they had against me was stuff that I had given them. So what does this tell you? I'm not telling you to be criminals.
Plead the fifth.
Plead the fifth. And they're like, well, where are your records for 2023? You're like, I don't know. I think my goat may have ate them. Right? So the other guy was a car dealer, and he had a large quantity of methamphetamine in a safe, and he actually showed them. Yeah. I don't know if he thought they would go easier on him, but the big piece of evidence was that big baggie of meth. Because when you hit a certain percentage or proportion of drugs, then they say you're a distributor. Truth is, this guy was just really a big meth head. And he just really, really, really liked meth. He wasn't selling it. It was just his personal stash. But he ended up going away for a long time, too. Oh, yeah. Someday when we've got more time, ask me to tell you the story about how they both flew on Con Air. And you guys know what Con Air is? It's the federal airline they fly convicts around on. Oh, yeah. It's a wild. I should have him come talk to you guys sometime. Okay. So we don't want to lie on our taxes. So if you really want to know what people are up to, ask them to see their tax returns. Okay, so those are all protective covenants. If I put those things in, it reduces the risk to the bondholders. As a result, it reduces the required return from the bondholders. That reduces my cost of borrowing. Now, what kinds of things would I promise to do or not to do? How about stuff I was already planning to do or not to do? If I'm not planning to merge, bam, that's real easy to throw in there. If I'm not planning on issuing additional long-term debt, bam, although I would be a little more careful with that one. I certainly am going to promise to provide my financial statements to them. In fact, I'm going to tell them I'm going to provide them audited financial statements, and then I'm going to follow through with that. Questions? Okay, now, one other thing we can do to reduce the cost of debt is to consolidate the debt. So, for example, let's start on the consumer level and then we'll take it to the corporate level. Right now, most of you, or some of you, probably have a car loan. You've got a monthly payment for that, and you've got credit cards. Some of you have a balance on your credit card, and then you've got student loans. What if you could take out a big loan, hopefully at a lower interest rate, and pay off all those debts? That's what we call debt consolidation. And typically, the way that debt consolidation works for homeowners is that they take out a home equity loan and pay off their higher interest rate debt, like the credit cards. So they're consolidating all that debt into one loan, the home equity loans. In the corporation, the more parties that we have money borrowed from, the more parties there will be at bankruptcy, and the more lawyers will have to be involved. For example, let's assume that all 7 of you had loaned me money. At bankruptcy, each one of you would have to have a lawyer representing yourselves. What if instead I only borrowed money from Mr. Home? What if I just borrowed from him? How many lawyers would I have to have then? Just one. And so as a result, the cost to borrow might be reduced as a result of consolidating my borrowing from one lender. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk about tax effects versus financial distress. Remember, if we think back to Modigliani-Miller Proposition 2 with taxes, it looks like to maximize the value of the firm, all we have to do is maximize the amount of debt, because the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus the tax rate times the amount of debt. And so basically it's saying, hey, let's cut loose, let's borrow as much as we can. Financial distress, though, we've been talking about how the cost of financial distress, it goes up the more debt we have, or the expected cost of financial distress goes up because the probability of financial distress goes up. And so what we end up with here is this trade-off, where we're trying to trade off the additional benefit of the tax shield versus the additional expected cost of financial distress. You guys might think, because so far everything you've seen in finance, we've had a handy-dandy formula. And you might say, well, wait a minute, it'd be real easy for us to come up with a formula to express this and figure out the exact optimal proportion of the firm that should be financed with debt. But you can't. And here's why. We can tell you exactly the benefit of the tax shield. But can I tell you exactly the expected cost of financial distress? No. And there's 2 reasons for that. If we look at the formula for the expected cost of financial distress, it's got the probability of financial distress, and it's got the cost of financial distress if it actually occurs. We don't know either one of those numbers. We don't know either one of those numbers with certainty. We know some of the direct cost numbers, perhaps, for the cost of financial distress, but we don't know the indirect cost numbers. And that probability of financial distress, whatever number that we came up with, would just be a good guess. What do you think the relationship is between the probability of financial distress and the amount of debt in the firm's capital structure? As the amount of debt in the firm's capital structure goes up, what happens to the probability of financial distress?
Also goes up.
It goes It goes up. So we can tell you that. The more debt you have, the higher your probability of financial distress. But we also know it's not a linear relationship. So we can't even come up with a fancy formula to tell you what is the probability of financial distress. And so we know that there's this optimal point, but we cannot calculate it exactly. Let's take a look at this graphically. First of all, we have the value of the firm from Moliani and Miller Proposition 2 without cost of financial distress. And that's just the value of the levered firm is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus the tax rate times the amount of money they owe. That's just a straight line. By the way, the axes here are value of the firm, and then debt is your horizontal axis. By the way, to maximize shareholder value, what do I need to do to the value of the firm?
Maximize.
Yeah, maximize it, because after all, debt is a fixed claim, right? And so only by maximizing the value of the firm can I maximize the shareholder wealth. And so what we see there is, well, it looks like without this financial distress that we should just load up on debt. But once we put in financial stress, we're going to see that there's a different story. Now we have another value up here, which is the value of the firm with no debt. And notice that it basically stays the same all the way across because a firm with no debt has no debt, right? So it's basically just the bottom point there. Now, what we're going to see though is when we first start out adding debt, the actual value of the firm, considering financial distress, is going to look a whole lot like the value of the levered firm without considering it. And here's why. If I'm a multi-million-dollar company and I take on $1,000 worth of debt, is it really going to impact my probability of financial distress all that much? No. What happens is we see in the beginning that kind of track together. But then we see that they start to part as that amount of debt gets higher. That starts to become a bigger problem. And so there's a nonlinear relationship between the amount of debt and the probability of financial distress. And that's why we see this curving effect here. In fact, we can see that there is a point at which, one single point, at which that curve reaches a maximum, that value of the levered firm when we consider financial distress. That is the point that maximizes the value of the firm. Therefore, the capital structure at that point is the optimal capital structure. We're going to call that optimal capital structure, the optimal amount of debt, B star. That's optimal. Now, can we determine what that level actually is? No, I just got through telling you we really don't have, we've got theory, but we do not have the correct numbers or equations to figure out exactly what's going on here. But we know theoretically here that we do have an optimal, and that if we are above or below that, we are not maximizing shareholder wealth. And so as a manager, it is your job to try to figure out the rough neighborhood of this optimal capital structure. And what we see is when we look at firms in the same industry, they tend to have similar capital structures. And so if you were just starting out in banking, for example, I would advise you to have a capital structure that's 90% debt and 10% equity. Because I have some fancy equation that I solved for something to find that? No. Because every other bank in the universe is running on roughly 90% debt. That's why. So we assume that whatever the industry has settled on must be close to that optimal structure. Thinking back to the BSG, do you guys have an estimate of what the optimal capital structure is? Yeah, what is it?
60-40.
It's close. It's 39 and 61, right? 39 debt, 61 equity. And if you think about this, are you helping yourself if you pay down that debt? No, because you're going to drop below the optimal. And what if you take on more debt than that? No. So you're hurting yourself either way. So that's why I'm telling you, one of your goals when you're making decisions is that you maintain that same capital structure. And this picture is the reason why. Questions? Okay. So, if you remember earlier, we've been talking about pies in here. Every time we talk about the pie, I get hungry. But see, we got this pie, and in the beginning, we said the pie was composed of two things. B plus S, or debt plus equity, right? Bonds plus stocks. But then we said, well, wait a minute. There's actually someone else has their finger in the pie. Who was that? The government. And their finger is in the pie through taxes. Well, now what we're going to say is there's actually more than just that. There's also this piece that we're going to call L. L is short for lawyers. L is short for lawyers. And so earlier what we were trying to do was minimize the government portion. And we said in order to do that, we would just borrow as much money as possible because that gives us a tax shield. However, now that we're including financial distress, we know that we're more likely to have to pay these lawyers if we have a boatload of debt. And so now what we're going to do is instead of minimizing just the G portion, the taxes, we're going to minimize G plus L. We're going to minimize G plus L. And that's going to give us our optimal capital structure that maximizes firm value and therefore maximizes shareholder wealth. So, think about the government and the lawyer thing though. Remember we said the more debt you have, the lower the smaller the pieces the government gets. But what happens to my likelihood of needing lawyers as that debt goes up? Right? And so what we're going to have, these things are kind of trading off. And so basically what we want to do is find the place where those things added together are minimized. Once again, do we have a neat formula for that? No. Can I take a first derivative of something and come up with where is the optimum? No. And so once again, what do? You look around the industry to figure out what kind of capital structure is minimizing that G plus L. Questions? So this is just the same thing, only in graphics. So here we have the bondholders and the shareholders, and we've previously seen the tax claims. Now we've got this orange piece called bankruptcy claims, and that would be the L portion from the previous slide, that bankruptcy claims. So who all does the value of the firm get paid out to? Shareholders and bondholders are two original groups, then the government, the one we added next, and now finally we have these bankruptcy claims. Now, don't get confused with the money that we have to pay to the bondholders in bankruptcy. We're talking about additional claims like lawyers and court costs and things like that. Questions? Okay, we will stop here for today. Next time we will start talking about signaling, and hopefully we'll finish chapter 15 and we'll get into chapter 16. Any questions?